been waiting way too long. Yeah, I've been down here trying to get it. Yeah, I've been waiting way too long.
In this video, we're going to discuss Chapter 8.2, Properties of Parallelograms. A parallelogram is a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel. Remember, a quadrilateral is a four-sided polygon. There are quite a few special types of quadrilaterals, and the parallelogram is the first one that we'll look at. So I've drawn a parallelogram here, but the way that it's drawn, there's not really any indication that it is a parallelogram. So we need to indicate what's happening here, that both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So to show that, I'm going to show that that is parallel to that, and also that this is parallel to that. So that's how we show parallel lines. I also want to remind you about when we talked about parallel lines cut by a transversal. So if these are parallel lines and this is a transversal, I want to remind you that we talked about all these relationships within these with these angles. Angles 2 and 6 are corresponding angles, therefore they are congruent. Angles 2 and 8 are same side exterior angles, which means they're supplementary. 3 and 6 are alternate interior angles, which makes them congruent, and 4 and 5 are alternate interior angles, which makes them congruent. So what happens when I add another transversal that is also parallel to the other? So if those are parallel and these two lines are parallel, I've just created a parallelogram. Where is that parallelogram? It's right here, and it doesn't look too pretty, but that would be your parallelogram. Why? Because both pair of opposite sides are parallel. And so when we remember what we learned, we know that angle 3 and angle 5 are going to add up to 180. Those are same side interior. And if I go ahead and label this as 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, okay, I can also say that 5 and 14 are going to add up to 180 because they are also same side interior. And so as a result, 3 is congruent to 14. Why? Because if 3 plus 5 equals 180 and 5 plus 14 equals 180, then 3 must equal 14 because 5 is congruent to itself. So we're going to see that played out, but if you can understand and remember what we talked about with parallel lines, that's going to make understanding parallelograms so much easier. So there are some theorems here that apply to parallelograms. These are basically the properties of the parallelograms. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its opposite sides are congruent. So, in other words, that will be congruent to that, and this will be congruent to that. If it is a parallelogram, that's important. We must know first that it's a parallelogram. If we know it's a parallelogram, then we know that this is true. The next property says that if it is a parallelogram, then its opposite angles are congruent. So what does that mean? That means that this angle is congruent to that angle, and this angle is congruent to that angle. That's kind of what we just talked about. If it is a parallelogram, then its consecutive angles are supplementary. We also just talked about this earlier with the parallel lines. So if I call this angle 1, 2, 3, and 4, the consecutive angles are angle 1 and angle 2. So the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180. That means supplementary. The measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 3 equals 180. Those are also consecutive. Measure of angle 3 plus measure of angle 4 equals 180. And the measure of angle 4 plus the measure of angle 1 equals 180. And again, based on those statements is how we figure out that the opposite angles are congruent. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its diagonals bisect each other. So remember, the diagonal connects the non-consecutive vertices. So that is one diagonal, and this would be the other diagonal. And it says the diagonals bisect each other. So what that means that this is the midpoint of both diagonals. So point A is the midpoint of both diagonals, which means I could indicate that this is congruent to that, And this is congruent to that. So those are the 4 properties of a parallelogram that you need to know. And if you know those properties, then you can solve problems in parallelograms. So it's very important that you understand these. I would, at the end of your notes in this video, I would make a list of the properties. And the properties are basically what comes after the then in each theorem. Opposite sides are congruent. Opposite angles are congruent. Consecutive angles are supplementary, and diagonals bisect each other. Those are the 4 properties of parallelograms that you need to know.
I've been waiting way too long.